Welcome everyone to our what was supposed to be the third expanded talk, but it's actually our second talk because what happens in 2021, no one can predict these days. So we were in the dark for most of the week in the state of Texas during that second talk. But I'm really excited, delighted to have my colleague, Dr. Alexander Wiseman, as our third speaker, who's going to talk about the new norms of education policy in the 21st century. Again, the point of these talks is to really bridge some of these conversations and transcend different branches of research, policy, and practice. And I can't think of a better speaker than Professor Wiseman to be joining us today and talking about this important topic. Just a little bit about Professor Wiseman. He has more than 25 years of professional experience working with government education departments, university-based teacher education programs, community-based professional development for teachers, and as a classroom teacher in both the US and East Asia. Professor Wiseman examines and informs educational policy development, leads strategic planning workshops, provides evidence-based training programs, speaks internationally, and presents extensively on the areas of evidence-based decision-making, teacher preparation, professional development, strategic planning, system assessment, reform, education policy, change management, and institutional capacity building, and more. So we are so delighted to have his expertise. He brings in practical and in research. And I think you are not going to be surprised that he is very prolific, both in his speaking engagements and also in his publications. He serves on the editorial board of Educational Administrative Quarterly, an educational researcher, and he is the author and editor of more than 100 articles, chapters, and books. So without further ado, I'm going to let Dr. Wiseman take over and begin his talk. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Kirksey. I really appreciate it. That was very generous of you. I think what that introduction mainly means is that I'm old. I've been around a while and I don't know how to say no. So maybe that's the takeaway from that. Anyway, I'm really glad to have everybody here. I appreciate you taking the time out of your Wednesday to spend a few minutes talking about education policy. What I'm really going to do, I think, more than talk about policy specific topics, is I'm going to talk about conceptually some of the different factors from the 20th and the 21st century that have maybe rubbed against each other a little bit, things that have conflicted a little bit, things that might be extending from the 20th century into the 21st that have really big policy implications, and there is a lot of policy that's developed around them. But I want to really make this more about the ideas. So if you're looking for me to point out passages from specific policies, this is not the talk. But if you want to talk a little bit about or think a little bit about some of the big ideas that are influencing policy, both in the 20th and the 21st century as we transition or have transitioned, then you're in the right place. So I'm glad to have you here. There are a couple things that I want to do before I get started on the actual talk. One is I want to give those of you who are here just some invitations to publish some work related to comparative education if you're interested. And I wanted to do a little self-promotion and tell you some of the things that I'm working on, and then we'll move forward. So the first thing that I would like to specifically say, these are, if you can't read it, that's okay. I'll send you an email if you just send me one at alexander.wiseman@ttu.edu. I happen to edit the annual review of comparative and international education. We are currently calling for chapter and discussion essay proposals for the 2021 volume. This will be the next of what is obviously an annual series. We've had some great volumes that have preceded this one, and we hope that yours will be one of those as well. If you'd like a copy of these calls, or if you have an idea, if you would shoot me an email, and I would be happy to share that with you. The other thing I would like to suggest is that if you are interested in publishing in our online journal, FIRE, the Forum for International Research in Education, this is an open source online journal. We publish exclusively comparative and international education related work. You can see I've given you, this is the current issue, which will expand by a couple more articles before we go to issue 2 this year. We have a wide variety of topics that are published in the journal. They are all peer reviewed. I want to say it again, this is an open source journal, so there's never any fee or charge. This is just, we're trying to publish some of the best scholarship related to comparative and international education research that's out there. Visit our site, read our articles, submit a manuscript for review, volunteer to be a reviewer. There's our complicated URL, but you can always just Google the name of the journal and it pops right up. So please do participate if you want to. I also want to just tell you a few things that I have going on right now. I just had a book come out last year on comparative perspectives on refugee youth education with some colleagues that I've been working with on a refugee education research team. We've got a really interesting collection of chapters in this book from people all over the world, certainly in the United States as well. One of the things that we do that's unique about this one is that we look at a refugee education in developed country context, which is a little different than some of the other research that goes on around refugees. And you can tell I've been working with a colleague, Ph.D. Kumar, on teacher quality and education policy in India. We have an edited and an authored book that are in press right now. They both will be out this spring. If you're interested in more refugee-related work, I just had an article come out in the Journal of Latinos in Education with my same colleagues from that research group, where we look at education and human rights for unaccompanied children in detention in the US, and then with a colleague, Lisa Damashki-Dietrich, on migration and refugees in education. And then probably the one that is most relevant to this talk today is the chapter I just did in Tavis Jules and his colleagues' handbook on comparative education theory, specifically looking at comparative ed through a neo-institutional lens. You'll probably see some of that neo-institutional thinking popping up from time to time as I talk today. For those of you who may be familiar with my work, that is certainly something that I have been able to expand on and work on over the years. And I'm always interested in people's feedback on that. But today, we're going to talk about some of the promise of 20th century advances in education and some of the pitfalls that we've seen so far in the 21st century. You may have noticed that in the title of the talk, the word new was in quotation marks or air quotes. The reason why is because this talk is eventually going to turn into a manuscript that will be published as part of a collection of work that's talking about new norms in education policy in the 21st century, but from a lot of different perspectives. My perspective, and I'm going to hopefully build a case for it today, is that those norms haven't really shifted that much. Even in spite of the fact that there have been some tremendous changes that have occurred just in the first 2 decades of the 21st century. The norms around education and as a result, a lot of the policies around education don't necessarily shift as quickly or as easily or in the same way as the context for the policy does. So even though we might have seen some really important problems develop in these first few decades of the 21st century, we're going to talk about the pandemic, we're going to talk about the politics that have been sort of major issues around the world and certainly persistent inequalities. So these sort of paradigm shifting events haven't shifted the norms in the same way. So I want to talk a little bit about that. In fact, what I really want to focus on, and that's on the far right side of this slide, is how remarkably permanent a lot of the idea, structures, content, and pedagogy is, for better and for worse. And I think I'm going to focus a little more on the worse today than I am the better. What I'd like to do is, and you can see at the bottom there, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the promises coming out of the 20th century related to education worldwide, some of the pitfalls that we've seen and experienced in the beginning of the 21st century, and then some of the persistence around the norms, values, and practices that we see in education, broadly speaking. All right, this is the messiest slide I have, so I apologize for the messiness. So there are 3 things there on the left side of the screen that I want to highlight as major developments or major, I shouldn't use developments because that's in the middle, major occurrences in the 20th century. And then I want to talk a little bit about some of the developments that have come from that or maybe spun off from that, and then we'll talk about some of the pitfalls. So three things that I want to in particular focus on. One is the massification of education in the 20th century. There's been a lot of work on this, some of it written by me, a lot of it by some other folks out of Stanford and other places that looked at or have looked at the way that education, specifically mass formal education, has become a global phenomenon. There's a very interesting and important work published by Ramirez and Bolai in the 80s that looks at sort of the origins of mass education in the 19th century with the development of the nation state. I think that's a really important work. But what I'm focusing on here is how during the 20th century, formal mass education really became a global sort of universal phenomenon, meaning that everywhere there are schools, everywhere there are students, most people, I would say, have the opportunity or at least access or at least know of education opportunities in their community as part of the formal mass education system. The next part of that, sort of a big development in the 20th century, has been the emergence of national education governance. So you might say, no big deal. This is kind of a taken for granted thing, but that work I alluded to earlier from Ramirez and Bolai, where they talk about the development of formal education as a part of the development of the nation state, I think takes off in the 20th century in a way that is unique. So for example, the development of national education systems and the use of national education systems as a tool for creating citizens and really developing a country is in many ways a uniquely 20th century phenomenon that brought with it a lot of positives as well as some pitfalls. Again, things that I'm going to talk a little bit more about as we go forward. And then finally, the idea that education is a human right, something that developed through the UN's Declaration of Human Rights. Article 26, if you haven't already seen it, you can Google that, you can see it. But the idea that everyone has the right to education. Again, these are fundamental developments during the 20th century that I think most folks who are involved in education policy or education development in some way in the 21st century take for granted, but we didn't 100 years ago. So it's really important to highlight that. And some of the developments then that have occurred over the 20th century and sort of lead into the 21st century are listed in the middle. And this is where some of these other images that I've just sort of shoved on this page come in. One would be the idea of sustainability or sustainable development. And you can see in this top image on the right, it's probably not super clear, but this is a track. I think this was published by UNESCO or the United Nations that looks at, education for all, and that declaration came in 1990. The Millennium Development Goals in 2000, the Sustainable Development Goals just a few years ago in 2015. But this idea that education can be a tool for the development of communities, for individual development, for other types of creation or sustainable resources and human rights and citizenship and things like that. Very important development during the 20th century, and a lot of what is really the backbone of international development from the mid 20th century forward. Education really has played a large role in that. There's tons of work that validates that. Another development, and this is why I have TIMSS and PISA highlighted in the little graphics on the right, is this the advent of really big data. Another thing that sort of took off mid 20th century and now has become pretty ubiquitous, not just at the international or cross-national level like TIMSS and PISA, but also within most national education systems. There is often a national testing or assessment program. There's some sort of data collection, even if it's just demographics around students and their backgrounds. And then in addition to that, the digitalization of content or the combination or the integration of technology into education and using technology as a tool, or at least selling it as a tool to facilitate enhanced access to reach school age youth that might be in very remote locations. But if you digitalize content and then you deliver it via some sort of technology platform, like a smartphone or a laptop or something like that, then education should be available regardless of the community that someone's in, or regardless of the the background that they bring to the situation. And then finally, this idea of learning for all, really a play or a build on education for all. Learning for all, as some of you probably know, is the title of the World Bank Group's Education Strategy 2020. But that's also reflected in, for example, Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030, or the Government of India's National Education Policy that was just released last year. This idea that all school-age youth have this human right to learn, and not just have access to education, which was part of the sort of massification of education push, but really have a learning experience as part of their educational career or development. But what we have, if I can get this to change, there we go, is that we see in the 21st century, there's a lot of promise, but we still are dealing with some of the sort of persistent norms, values, structures that might not always be so positive as we move into the 21st century. Those include institutionalized inequalities, polemical and populist politics, crises such as the health crisis around the pandemic and the shift in educational delivery that has occurred in some places as a result of that. So I want to take some time, well, maybe just a few minutes, to bring us through some of these advances in education, specifically around the idea of equitable access, opportunity, and outcomes. By the way, I would challenge most of you to find an education policy that doesn't address one or more of these areas in it. Access, opportunity, and outcomes for learning, and making those equitable has been really one of the huge or largest outcomes of 20th century education policy. So as I said before, the massification of education has led to what I think we can pretty safely call universal enrollment. Now, I'm not saying that 100% of school-age youth are enrolled 100% of the time, but we've gone in a matter of 100 years, we've gone through an educational transformation where education, at least formal education, was only available to the elite or only available to small communities, like the one-room schoolhouse on the left of this slide suggests, to situations like the classroom in South Africa that you see, that even once incredibly marginalized populations are now part of modern formal education systems all over the world. There's been some great work. This is actually from the Brookings Center for Universal Education, and they're citing Evan Schofer's work from the earlier part of the 20th century. Some great work that looks at how schooling has expanded over the last, well, in this case, 200 years in this slide, but I'm showing between those blue bars, just the 20th century. I mean, the jump in enrollment is amazing. And this access to education, equitable access to education idea is a really important outcome of shifts in policies around education related to who goes to school, how schools are resourced, where schools are located, how schools are governed, etc. Another advance during the 20th century related to the opportunity to learn or opportunity for education is in terms of how national education systems have developed. I think this is a really important, often overlooked development, at least now. It hasn't always been that overlooked. The idea, though, that when nations are governing education, the de facto or the assumption is that education is a public good. It's something that is available to everyone who is a citizen of that community. It's something that helps develop productivity. It's something that is in many ways considered or assumed to be a natural part of youth development. And all of that sort of spins out of the national education governance or system idea. There's also the idea that education that is governed by a national system levels the playing field. In other words, everybody who's a citizen of that community should have equal or equitable access and opportunity within that education system, and that there would be shared resources and some sort of common investment that would be used to facilitate that level playing field of education. Final big advance or assumed benefit of education coming out of the 20th century is the idea that education improves outcomes, not just outcomes in terms of school, so improved academic achievement, but there have been literally decades and decades and decades of studies and policies and development initiatives that have looked at the way that participating in education creates benefits not just for the individual, but for the whole community. And you can look at rate of return analyses if you want to go, that sort of very strict route, or you can look more broadly at the way that there are transitions from school into life contexts like university or career that might have individual benefits as well as larger benefits in terms of entrepreneurship and technology development and political cohesiveness and all the other sorts of outcomes that come from that. So we sort of sit at this balance of thinking about all of the ways that education in the 20th century has developed in a way that shows the promise. And by the way, of all the slides I'm going to show you, this is probably the second most important one just because it balances out the promise and pitfall and really highlights the cloaking idea, which is where I'm going with this. But we've got on the one hand, this promise of equitable access, opportunity, and outcome. And then on the other hand, and this is what I'm gonna, this is where we take a dark turn. I'm gonna take a little bit of time to talk about some of the persistent pitfalls that we see in the 21st century, which is why I'm suggesting maybe the norms haven't changed as much as we would hope. But this persistent inequality, persistent decoupling, and I'll explain that in a minute, and persistent cloaking. So first of all, persistent inequality, institutionalized sexism, racism, classism, they all are still with us. In other words, even though we've had all these developments, all the things that I just very briefly went over, which there has been a massive amount of attention and research paid to, even with all of that, we're still sort of stuck in this place where we have these the same problems of inequality replicating themselves within schools. And we even have, as I point out with the first bullet point here, this conflicting equity expectations in school and out of school. Now, I'm not going to say that schools do anything perfectly. That would be silly, and of course they don't. However, there is a lot of evidence to suggest that, especially policies that are developed around school content, school opportunities, school access, school curriculum, that there is not only a sort of culture of equity that it's embedded in these policies as they're developed, but it tends to be getting more equitable as we move forward. Now that's, some people will think that's a really controversial statement, and perhaps it is. The sort of caveat to that maybe will make some of you hate that I just said that less, is that when you have these sort of formal structures and systems in schools that are at least on the surface look equitable, and you mix them with all of the contextual inequalities that exist. So nobody shows up at school, teachers, students, administrators, etc. Nobody shows up with a blank slate. There's no tabula rasa that happens when you enter the school building. We all are bringing, everybody is bringing all of the baggage that comes from the community, from their background, from their home life, from their expectations, from their own norms and values. And even though we may have an expectation that equity exists within the school context, it rarely is delivered in a completely equitable fashion. And so, again, not saying that there aren't unequal policies that exist. I'm saying that there's been a lot of development over the 20th century and into the 21st that sets up more equity in school than out of school. I'll give you an example. Some of you know that I've done quite a bit of work in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia with their Ministry of Education. And I'm going to use them as an example because it's a really easy and obvious one. There are more subtle explanations and situations all over, but this is the one I'm going to use. In Saudi Arabia, they have a completely gender segregated educational system. There are boys only schools and girls only schools. There are no mixed gender schools. That means in the boys only schools, as many of you probably know, there are only male teachers, male administrators, male students. In the girls only schools, it's the same thing, but it's only women and girls. So we have this system, and by the way, this blends with the rise of parallel system. systems, we have this education system that is fundamentally segregated. But if you look at equity indicators like enrollment, like achievement levels, like opportunity to learn, and I have done these studies, please look at my work on this, you find that the boys' schools and the girls' schools are performing at the same level, or maybe sometimes the girls are performing better on average, that they're enrolling at the same percentage, and that their opportunities to learn, meaning their resources, their teachers, their curricula are all the same. So we see this interesting situation where in the school system, even though it's a parallel system where you have one system for boys and one for girls, all of the equity indicators come out relatively equal. Now that's interesting in that, yes, the school itself, even though it maintains this parallel system, has created a rather equitable indicators that come out of it. But in the larger society, we can make the argument that things are not equal. And so that really affects the way that education is delivered and perceived, even within the system. So once boys and girls leave the system of education and move on to university or move into careers or whatever they end up doing, there are limitations for girls that do not exist for boys. I won't go into the whole thing, read my work on this. There are opportunities for boys that are not available to girls. There are expectations that favor boys over girls in some situations and girls over boys in other situations that often are very sort of stereotypical in alignment with the broader culture. Now, that doesn't mean that their system is necessarily bad or evil or what. I'm not trying to make that statement. But what I am saying is that even though we might see equity within the school system, we're not necessarily seeing it outside of the school system. Another way to think of this persistent inequality is the idea of schools within schools. This is something I'm going to use a completely different type of example here, and I'm going to come back to the United States. Often magnet schools or charter schools, probably magnet schools more than charter schools. They often are located in marginalized communities, and they will have a special program that has advanced academics of some sort. And they will draw students not only from the local community, but from elsewhere. And what we see is that often the schools themselves have two populations in them. One made up of the local community that might be from a marginalized background, might be lower income, might be whatever. And the other population would be those who are coming specifically for the magnet program. They usually have a lot more opportunities. They're usually from the dominant race or ethnic community group. So you'll see the school within school pattern replicating the inequalities that exist outside of school, while at the same time providing opportunities for education that might seem equitable if we were just looking at the policies and the structures themselves. Last thing I want to say, I think it's the last thing I want to say before I move on to the next phase is, and it's not the last thing. The second thing I want to say is persistent decoupling. And when I talk about decoupling, so this is where my neo-institutional speak comes back a little bit. We often talk about loose coupling or decoupling when there is a script or a model that is typical for an organization to follow. Education has a model like that. It's very easy to sort of imagine the template for education and then imagine ways that the implementation differs from that. It certainly builds on what I was just talking about. Policies tend to be a really good way to see that, because the policy will sort of envision one version of education, and then the implementation of that policy, or ignoring that policy and not implementing it at all, would be a way that the actual activity decouples from the intended policy. We see that happen with politics. And so all these ideas about the nation state and national systems of education or government controlled education and the good things that could come out of it tend to be decoupled from some of the outcomes. So for example, the idea that government-controlled education or national education systems can develop citizens. In other words, it's a way to incorporate people into the broader citizenship community. Can be, and we see examples of this in the early 21st century, as well as the early 20th century, if we want to go back in history, is that nationalism has often trumped the idea of citizenship. Not necessarily play on words there. The idea that we focus more on the nation itself rather than the individuals and what's good for them. We also see, and by the way, you can see there's a really interesting group of studies, which I did not cite on this slide, I apologize for that, that look at civics education and the ways that civic education has shifted and expanded over time. And you can see some fluctuations in it. The formal civics education programs often reflect, at least in the study itself, issues around democracy and citizenship and things like that. But the way that they're implemented, especially in communities that have nationalist tendencies, even within the United States, for example, which is supposed to be a democratic republic, they will often emphasize nationalism or nationalist tendencies over broader citizenship goals. That's interesting. Privatization rather than leveling. So we've seen the politics of education sort of get into the privatization game. It's a way, and those of you who are familiar with neoliberal theories will follow this well. It's a way to get into the idea of decentralizing the responsibility and the resource usage for education to local levels by privatizing, or shift it to the individual users, the students and families, rather than using education as a leveling tool where it's shared resources and shared investment for the public good. We can also see that there is a shift depending on the political groups or parties that are dominant in the education systems in the 21st century, a shift towards more deregulation instead of this idea of, well, maybe I shouldn't use the word regulation necessarily, but the idea that there are standards that education institutions and educators themselves are held to. When we deregulate, when we shift responsibility and we shift the standard setting to more individual, local, state levels, rather than having a shared understanding at the nation level, there tends to be less of an investment in the public good and more of an investment in the private good for certain communities. And then the idea of cloaking, which is kind of where all of this is headed. So the idea of cloaking is that, and we've seen this, if you haven't seen this in your own community, let me know. I'll be happy to point out some examples. We've seen this time and again since the pandemic has sort of changed the way that education is delivered in a lot of different communities around the world, that when there's a shift to, let's say, hybrid learning or remote learning, or when there has to be a change in venue from the formal school building to another location, often those who are affected the most are those who are already from marginalized communities. This can have to do with resources that are or are not available. This can have to do with cultural expectations about what is and is not considered learning, or what is or is not considered attendance, or what is or is not considered an appropriate curriculum. We have seen that this time and again, these shifts in the paradigm around how formal or mass education works have exacerbated what I would suggest we call cloaked inequalities in access and opportunity to learn. This idea of cloaking is a really important one, I think, and one that I'm going to hammer in just a second. So as we transition, we've got persistent inequality through all of these developments. Even though we have access, opportunity, and outcomes as sort of these 20th century promises, we see that the pandemic and polemics around politics and education have really exposed the way that inequality persists regardless of these developments. In other words, these are things that might have been subtle, a year or 10 years ago, and now we see them in much starker light. So why is that? Well, first of all, self-promoting again, I have a paper coming out with my colleague Patrina Davidson in Policy Futures in Education that looks at the cloak of equality in the South African context. But, and also I wanted to talk a little bit about cloaking by using some images. I'm just going to take a side note here. When you Google men in cloaks, there are a lot of funny images that come up. Most of them have to do with Lord of the Rings. But anyway, I wanted to show this because I think it's important to think about sort of what the imagery means, this cloak of equality. Right? The idea is that on the outside, or at least what we see from the formal version, things look relatively equal. There are the same sorts of structure. There are the same sorts of ideas about, in our case, the 20th century, access, opportunity, and outcomes. And this visual of what the cloak looks, I mean, these two men look, assuming their cloaks were a little more alike, they would look relatively equal in their cloaks. But what we don't know is what's underneath. Maybe there are differences in a background. Maybe there are differences in resource opportunities. Maybe there are differences in what they're able to do. Maybe there are differences of all sorts that we cannot see because they're cloaked by this relatively equal outer garment. So I just want to really push this idea of cloaking a little more. So on the left, we're all under the sort of the same laws and policies. The cloak represents the official policy and the official curriculum, which tends to reflect equitable access, opportunity, and outcomes, right? And then it also reflects the idea of human rights and the justice and values that goes along with that, and the standards that are established as part of the formal system that reflect those values. But on the right, we see, and this is where you go with me on this, if you're at all familiar with functionalism, the sort of theoretical, sociological version of functionalism, the idea that society is often, and we could use education systems as well, are often described as a body, right? All of the parts of the body provide a different and a necessary function from a functionalist point of view. Now, this perspective is often used to justify inequalities. You could say, is there a part of the system that could be, or of the body that could be eliminated and the body would still function? I mean, I could chop off my pinky, I'd have a little trouble typing, but I'd still live, right? The same has been used to justify inequalities in the broader society or in broader systems if you take that functionalist view. But it also reflects, I think, very accurately the de facto implementation of experiences that reflects differentiation and resource allocation, or the certain dominance of particular cultural communities, or what's acceptable standards for one group versus another group. That's one of the things that always bothers me when you see government reports on education or institutional reports that talk about, groups that met basic competency. So basic competency is the acceptable standard for some, but it would be considered failing for others, even though it's the official way to look at it. So we have this cloaking that occurs, and this idea that as we've shifted from the 20th century into the 21st century, the cloak itself has still exists. We're still hiding all the inequalities that exist below that. And what we have seen in the early part of the 21st century, if nothing else, is the peeling back a little bit of the cloak. If we use a very simple example from my own local community, when the pandemic hit and, schools closed and all of the education shifted to remote learning, there was a lot of scrambling that was going on. By the way, a lot of very well-meaning and dedicated educators to do whatever they needed to do to make sure that the students that they worked with were getting the education they needed. And we saw that in a lot of ways, there was no way that there could be equitable distribution of education because the fundamental inequalities existed beyond the education system itself, or in many ways were exacerbated by the sort of high level equity in the policy, which didn't necessarily reflect in the day-to-day experiences for students when they left the classroom or when they left the school building. Okay, so told you it was going to be conceptual. As I move forward with this, I'm developing it in a couple of different ways. I'll be adding a lot of examples, not only from my own community, but worldwide. I will tell you as I develop this a little bit more into the manuscript I told you was coming out of this, I will be using more examples from Saudi Arabia and South Africa. Those are two communities that I briefly mentioned as we were talking today, mostly because they're really interesting situations. And they have systems that have addressed the idea of gender and race or ethnicity very tangibly over the past several decades in the late 20th, early 21st century. Okay, so I think we have time for questions or comments or concerns. I will look in the chat thing and I will stop sharing. So maybe it'll look more normal. So if you would like to ask a question, I think you can type it into the chat thing and I'll see it. If you would like to do it a different way, I don't know if Jacob, I know, is with us, but sort of serving dual duty right now. But I'm happy to respond to any questions that you put into the chat thing, or suggestions or comments, or we can talk about your day. So Elizabeth Brown has asked, how do we become more involved in this type of research? I'm in the EDD program. Well, first of all, I don't know which EDD program you mean, but if you mean the EDD program in educational leadership at Texas Tech, you've got a lot of really good faculty members who are already doing important work that maybe not be exactly the same as what I've just described, but looking at equity and equity issues in education, especially from a leadership perspective. Dr. Valle is one, Dr. Almager is another. I would reach out to those two if that's what you're talking about. Oh, yes, that is what you're talking about. And talk to them about the work that they're doing. I think that would be great. You can also, shoot me an email. I'm also in the leadership program with these colleagues. And so always happy to communicate. Great question. Love to talk to you more. Other questions? Yeah, you're welcome. Okay, Amanda Gonzalez has said, going back to your slide about institutionalized sexism in education, how does it work for public schools that open young men and women leadership academies? How does funding work for public schools that open leadership academies for young men and women? So Amanda, I'm not sure if you're asking specifically if I know about the funding issues for the academies. I do have some experience working in single sex education research. It's a little different, I think, than what you're asking. There are a lot of different ways that single sex schooling occurs in the US and worldwide. Some of that has to do with providing opportunities. Some of that has to do, as I pointed out, with Saudi Arabia, more segregation related to cultural or religious expectations. If we're looking in the US specifically, you wouldn't find that sort of situation that we have in Saudi Arabia. Single sex schooling in the US is often used as a way to promote or support the education of individuals based on expectations that in a single sex context, they will be more active or more involved, or they will get better attention from educators. You've probably seen that there's a lot of research that shows that boys tend to dominate the attention of teachers over girls in a lot of situations, mostly because they're louder, or they tend to be more, I'll say it more positively, they tend to be more active. They tend to be engaged in a different way. So I don't know exactly how to answer your question, Amanda, other than, other than that. If you have another question or another comment to follow up on that, though, put it in the chat thing. Okay, Levi Johnson has asked, any predictions about how the global landscape looks on some of these dimensions in light of the pandemic? Seems like commitments to equity have to be seriously tested. So it's a really good question. The global efforts from national ministries of education or departments of education, as well as some of the larger development organizations like the World Bank or multilateral organizations like the UNESCO and others, tend to be sticking with the same arguments, broadly speaking. I mean, the shift has been from education for all, which had more of an access ring to it, to learning for all, as I pointed out. And so I don't think that shift is going to change much. In light of the pandemic and sort of the exposure of some of the inequalities that exist beyond that, the challenge has more to do, or maybe I should say it this way, the challenge has less to do with the education systems themselves sometimes, and more about how those education systems interact with or actually influence equity within broader communities. So you might have a school that is doing everything right, but in the community, there's still massive inequalities related to race, class, or gender. And fixing what happens in the broader community is often a bigger challenge than what happens within the specific school context. Attitudes and expectations can change. By the way, there's a whole bunch of interesting work, especially around gender and gender inequalities, which I also have been involved in some of that, where we can show that over time, expectations for girls and women in education have actually increased, which is a positive thing. So as a result of that, enrollment for women is now roughly equal to men, in some cases greater than men. I'm going to go back to the access, opportunity, and outcome thing. Opportunities to learn are now relatively equal for boys and girls, or men and women, in at least primary and secondary school. Not necessarily the same at higher ed level, although it's actually sometimes in favor of women over men. And then in terms of achievement or outcomes, we see that girls will often outperform boys. But as I was starting to point out, or maybe I did point out with the Saudi Arabian example, some of that has to do with the fact that boys don't always need education in order to advance outside of school. So I'm sure you know about networking. There's a network for boys that is often different from that for girls. We see that it is embedded in cultures. Saudi Arabia is a great example. I've done a lot of work on that. And so you'll see that a boy who maybe doesn't finish school or does poorly in school will still get a high status job or be recommended for advancement into a career based on family connections rather than on individual performance. And so in that situation, the education system has focused more on individual equity and less on familial networks or other kinds of connections that would provide advantages and disadvantages. And so the idea of equity in school and out of school approaches the issue from a different direction. Okay, let me move on. Another question, you mentioned your research in other areas like Saudi Arabia and Africa. What about the US situations? What do you think are the prevalent pitfalls in the US context, particularly as the effects of the pandemic? I'll tell you the biggest pitfall in the United States is our decentralized system and the amount of variation we have in equity and equitable opportunities for education. We are, of any system, and I've been doing comparative and international education research for most of my career, of any education system in the world, we are always, we being the United States, are always the most variable, meaning that there are more highs and lows and less of the sort of normal distribution with the big bunch in the middle in the US than anywhere else. We have some of the best educated, the best education systems, the best teachers, I would argue very strongly, in the world, at the same time that we have some of the worst students and the worst teachers and the worst schools in the world. Most of that has to do with the fact that education is decentralized. We have independent school districts in the United States, meaning that the federal government itself really only monitors education when it relates to funding, if you have the wrong person at the federal level, that makes a big difference. Don't get me wrong. And depending on your opinions about the Trump administration and Betsy DeVos, we could make a lot of arguments about how that was really a shift. And even though it was mostly funding decisions that were being shifted and funding priorities that were being shifted, it makes a huge difference in the way that education can be equitably delivered. But even without that, just the fact that we have so many, I mean, technically every district can say, screw you to the state and to the federal government if they don't care about funding. For most of the things they do, districts operate on a very sort of independent level, which is interesting. Now, they don't usually enact it that way, but they do. So I would say that the US situation is mostly related to variability, and we've not affected that very well. And as the fallout from the pandemic has reflected those inequities. So we'll see in the same school district, Some students who go to a high school in a more well-funded or well-off community, they will be very they'll be fine. The effect of them, working from home rather than in a classroom will be minimal. While others in the same school district who are from a less affluent or a more marginalized community will find it difficult to find resources in um, perhaps the language they speak at home, or resources for hardware or software that are necessary to access the technology needed to connect with their class. Or they might have different responsibilities because their family maybe is low income and now they can't afford childcare because of the pandemic, and so they have responsibilities for watching siblings as well as what they're doing or working outside of the home. I could go on for a long time about that one. I'll move on. Okay, another question. What about studies that integrate sex under identity education inside the curriculum? What do you suggest? I'm not really sure what that question is. Studies that integrate sex and identity education inside the curriculum. So sex and identity certainly have a lot of overlap. Um, I'm gonna pass that one. Maybe you could clarify a little bit. Uh, Amanda has followed up on her earlier question about single gender public schools and how do they receive federal funding. I have to scroll back up to what you asked before. So how does funding work for single sex schools? How do they continue to receive funding if those are single gender schools that we're talking about? Well, we could talk about equal opportunities for all and just make it clear that there are opportunities that have to be offered that are appropriate for all individuals under U.S. Education policy. I feel like this is a question that we need to discuss where there's getting back and forth, because I'm trying to guess what you're getting at, and maybe I'm not. Maybe I'm just being thick. I'm not really getting it. Sam Hop. Hey, Sam, remaining conceptual. Are or how are lessons learned globally in this space transferred into other environments and replicated beyond concept? Are national situations so unique that this is not applicable? And if so, how will localities know what are actual best practices? So thanks for the conceptual question, Sam. I appreciate you remaining conceptual with me. So there's a lot that we can do actually to link the cloak with the body. So to go back to that analogy, and a lot of it has to do with integrating the local voice or the body's voice into the development of the cloak. So cloaks, or the policies and curriculum and the sort of official structure of education, is often developed outside of or without all of the input necessary from the implementation or target community. One of the things that we could do, I think, pretty easily is to make sure that these cloaks, these policies, these curricula are modified with representative voices from across the spectrum of communities that are served or targeted. Now, I say it's easy. It's not really that easy, because whenever you have someone, especially when we're talking about national policy and national development, someone from a target community who's selected to be a voice in the development of these national level policies is usually somebody who's already got an advantage, right? You're not just picking somebody randomly out of the community and saying being a part of this. So it's not going to always be exactly representative, but it's closer. So that's one way to do it. Another way is that a lot of policies are not evaluated or followed up on when they're implemented. That has been actually a really big complaint around international education development for a long time, and continues to be so. A lot of policies are implemented. Sorry, let me start over. A lot of initiatives are developed and then turned into policies or programs that are implemented locally based on political agendas for national governments or for development organizations or others, rather than around the needs of the community. Well, anyway, a lot of examples of that. So one thing to consider is that often things are developed not because there's a need, but because it's something that is not because there's a need at the local level, but because there's a need at the political level. The other thing is that often funding for these initiatives dries up, or there's an initiative to implement something, for 5 years, and after 5 years it goes away because the funding was for a particular time period, or it was meant to serve a particular purpose that then ends. These kinds of initiatives, even though they might be super beneficial to the community, are often not evaluated because there's no intention to continue supporting them from the either the political side or from the side of the development organization that was implementing that program in the first place. So our national situation is so unique that this is, it wouldn't make sense to transfer or replicate the ideas. No, but what would be more important is to see how we might go about connecting broader ideas to local implementation, and how we might replicate the idea of integrating local voice with the development of policy. That would probably be the bigger one. Hey, Emily Meadows. Have you seen any common threads among schools that are more willing to lift the proverbial cloak and address their inequities? Looking forward to reading. Oh, thank you. So, common threads among schools or systems that are more willing to lift the cloak and address their inequalities. So I'm just going to be real, like negative Nelly for a second. No, I haven't seen a lot of really good models for that. Not from a system approach. I've seen more good models from individuals, and as individuals sort of develop their ability to understand inequality within their own school or their own system, they will often become the champion for that and drive it. I haven't seen common threads other than that. This development of champions tends to work a lot. I'm not saying they don't exist. I'm talking about my own exposure to practice and policy and the research related to that. That's good to see you, Emily, or talk at you. Let's see. Emilia has asked, in light of the pandemic, virtual school enrollment, particularly speaking of those in the Texas Virtual School Network under TEA, has increased due to their tenure in virtual education compared to local school district. As norms continue to play out, is there research on the horizon for how the norms play out in this education environment compared to that of brick and mortar? So it's a really good question, actually. And I'm gonna summarize your question the way that I think it's reading. Are there norms for virtual or remote learning that either mimic, replicate, or go a different direction from the norms and policies related to education for brick and mortar formal education? So one of the problems has been that there have not necessarily been norms for virtual schooling that have differed significantly enough from the norms for brick and mortar schooling that they have been able to just sort of step in and fill the gap and make this transition to remote learning smoother. There are, of course, a lot of organizations, including the one that you just mentioned under TEA, that have been thinking about the regular education system. By regular, I mean brick and mortar. So it's really important that the involvement in that kind of education, if it's not something that is the expectation or the regular delivery model for a particular group, just shifting to that or making that the norm for everyone without the preparation to do so is usually not going to run that smoothly. I see Jacob is back. Well, he's taken control of the of hosting. So that tells me something. We might be towards the end of this. I see that there are a couple of other questions. Ugo, I see your question. I apologize, but I think we might be out of time. Is that right, Jacob? I think we're at the end. There will be a recording of this, and Jacob, you tell me if you want to add to that, where it's going to be available, etc.
No, thank you, Dr. Wiseman, for the fantastic session. Yes, we recorded this, and so the recording will be made available on our website once we process it for captioning and all that good stuff. So thank you all for coming.